The world we think we know is changing. Could it be that we haven't realized it yet? Hello, I'm the thinker. The world today seems to move along an invisible line, a silent border between what we knew and what we still cannot fully understand. These are not simply isolated events or passing events. It is not news that appears and disappears in the constant flow of information. They are signs, signs that, when looked closely, begin to reveal that something deeper is at work within the global system. But here a question arises that we cannot avoid. Are we really facing the birth of a new global order, or simply facing a new phase of a historical process that in different forms is repeated over and over again? History is not a straight line. It never was. History behaves like a pendulum. It oscillates between extremes, order and chaos, stability and uncertainty, expansion and withdrawal. And every time that pendulum reaches one of its limits, it inevitably begins its return movement. If we look at the past with some perspective, we find patterns that repeat themselves with remarkable clarity. The Roman Empire, for example, managed to build a power structure over the centuries that seemed definitive. Its legal system, its military organization, its capacity for expansion, and its territorial control generated a feeling of permanence. It seemed eternal. However, that same system began to slowly deteriorate from within. It was not an immediate collapse, nor a sudden drop. It was a prolonged process, an accumulation of internal tensions, economic wear and tear, political conflicts, and loss of cohesion. What is truly relevant is not only the fall of Rome, but what happened afterward. The world did not disappear. Order was not extinguished. It was transformed. New structures emerged. New forms of political, social, and economic organization took their place. What seemed like the end was actually a transition. Centuries later, the world once again went through a moment of profound reorganization after the Second World War. The planet was divided into two large power blocs. The United States and the Soviet Union not only represented two military powers, but also two ideological models, two ways of understanding the world. The Cold War was, in essence, a tense balance. It was not stability in absolute terms, but it was a structured order. There were implicit rules, strategic limits, and clearly defined zones of influence. For decades, that system functioned as a framework for international politics. Everything revolved around that balance. And when that model came to an end, many believed that the world had finally achieved a form of definitive stability. A unipolar order seemed to be consolidated. But history once again showed that it does not stand still. Today we observe the emergence of new dynamics that challenge that scheme. China has ceased to be simply an emerging power and has become a central player on the global stage. Russia seeks to regain strategic influence, and regions like the Middle East once again occupy a central place where multiple interests converge. So the question comes up again. Are we facing a definitive break or a reconfiguration process? It is important not to fall into simplistic interpretations. Not all change implies collapse. Many times what we are observing is a profound realignment in the distribution of global power. The concept of new global order generates concern because it is associated with uncertainty. But the world has never been static. Stability is not permanent. It is just a point of balance within a constant movement. From a Stoic perspective, this reality takes on a particular meaning. Stoicism teaches us to distinguish between what depends on us and what does not. And large geopolitical movements completely escape our ability to control. But that does not imply passivity, it implies understanding. Understand without fear. Understand without falling into simplifications. Understand without reacting impulsively. Because in times of change, confusion becomes one of the greatest dangers. We live in an era where information circulates with unprecedented speed. Every fact is amplified. Each narrative tries to impose itself. And in that environment, thinking calmly becomes a balancing act. Perhaps the real challenge is not anticipating where the world is headed, but learning to maintain clarity as that world changes. Because the pendulum will continue to move. He has always done it, and it will continue to do so. Therefore, rather than asking ourselves if we are entering a new global order, perhaps we should ask ourselves deeper questions. Prepare to adapt without losing our principles? Are we prepared to think clearly amidst the noise? There is, however, an even deeper dimension that begins to emerge at this point. Until now, Stoicism has been understood primarily as an individual tool, a philosophy to organize personal life, to face adversity and sustain inner clarity. But perhaps the time has come to take a step further, to think about Stoicism not only of the individual, but also of the people. Because towns, like people, can lose clarity. They can react impulsively. They can let themselves be carried away by fear or euphoria. They can fall into narratives that simplify reality. And when that happens, your decision-making capacity is weakened. This is where collective psychology takes on a fundamental role. Thinkers like Sigmund Freud showed how masses can behave differently than the individual, and authors such as Emilio Mira and Lopez provided a deeper understanding of the psychic tensions that cross human groups. From this perspective, the pendulum of history is not only a political or economic phenomenon, it is also a psychological phenomenon. People not only act, they oscillate. They oscillate between security and fear, between reason and emotion, between stability and reaction. And understanding this completely changes the way we look at the world, because we stop seeing events as isolated events and begin to understand them as part of a deeper process. A process where each crisis also opens opportunities for reorganization, growth, internal strengthening. From here, a new idea begins to take shape, a different way of understanding geopolitics, a geopolitics that is not based solely on confrontation, but on understanding, a Stoic geopolitics, not like a utopia, but as a necessity, a way of interpreting global processes from clarity, understanding historical cycles, and understanding the behavior of people. Because when people develop clarity, when they understand without reacting impulsively, when they uphold principles in the midst of change, they stop being simple spectators of history, and they begin to navigate it. There is an element that is fundamental to understanding this historical moment, and that is often left out of superficial analysis: the speed with which changes occur today, and the way in which that speed affects our perception of reality. In other times, great historical processes took place over generations. The changes were profound, but their manifestation was slow. This allowed societies to progressively adapt to new conditions. Today, however, the dynamic is different. Technology has accelerated times. Information circulates instantly. Decisions have immediate impact. And this generates a permanent feeling of instability. But that sensation does not always reflect structural reality. Because although events seem accelerated, deep processes continue to have a long-term logic. The rise of a power, the transformation of an economic system, the reconfiguration of alliances do not happen overnight. They are processes that develop slowly. And this is where a key difference between perception and reality appears. Perception moves fast. Structural reality, no. When we confuse both things, we begin to interpret each event as if it were final, each conflict as if it were the beginning of a total collapse, each tension as if marking a point of no return. But history shows us something different. The big changes are not clearly announced. They develop in silence. They accumulate, and only with time do they become evident. Understanding this allows us to move away from the immediate drama and towards a deeper reading of the events. If we take this reflection one step further, an even more interesting question appears: the relationship between understanding and action. Because it's not just about understanding what happens, it is also about how this understanding influences the way in which people position themselves in the face of change. A people that misinterprets reality acts badly. A people that reacts from fear tends to make defensive decisions. A people that reacts from euphoria tends to overestimate itself. In both cases, the lack of clarity generates imbalance. This is where Stoic geopolitics begins to show its full value. Not as an abstract theory, but as a form of positioning. Excessive reaction to that change. History is full of examples where errors came not from the events, but from the way those events were interpreted. And this is deeply human. Therefore, developing a Stoic view of geopolitics does not imply neutrality or passivity. It implies balance. It implies the ability to analyze without losing perspective, to act without losing principles, to understand without being carried away by the noise. And when that capacity begins to develop on a collective level, something interesting happens. People stop being predictable in their reaction and begin to be coherent in their behavior. And that coherence is, ultimately, a form of strength. Perhaps we are witnessing, without fully realizing it, something more than a simple shift in the balance of global power. Perhaps we are facing the beginning of a new way of understanding geopolitics. And if so, it will not be the strongest who prevails, not even the fastest, not even the most powerful. It will be the one who manages to understand. Understand without fear. Think without noise. Act without losing your principles. Because in a world that constantly changes, the real advantage is not in anticipating the future, but in sustaining clarity while that future is built. If these types of reflections resonate with you, I invite you to be part of this space. Subscribe, follow this path, and let's continue thinking together. Because think well. It's not just an idea, it is a way of living better.